of an ASMR. Hello, 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 and welcome back to my channel. To those of you who are returning, and welcome, 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 welcome to anybody new. For those of you who are returning, you may notice some differences. Unfortunately, my Blue Yeti microphone, just stopped working the other day. So now I'm using the Tascam DR05X, and I always have really liked the kind of crispiness, I guess, of the Tascam, but it does pick up more sound, like background noise, than the Yeti does, so I apologize for that. But that's not what this video is about. This video, hopefully you read the title, this video is going to be about the history of the Dunmer, or the Dark Elves. This video has been long anticipated by long-time viewers of the channel, because I've kind of been talking about it for a little while, but I haven't been able to sit down and film the video. So here it is, finally. So the Dunmer story is a long, compelling, complex, and tragic one. It's full of divine achievements, great feats of magic, and strength, and tragic downfalls. The Dunmer, or the Dark Elves from the Elder Scrolls universe, have some of the densest and deepest lore in the Elder Scrolls universe as a whole. So I thought it would be more efficient and effective to kind of split this up, maybe make this into a series of videos. And this will be the first one. So this video is going to be focused on the overall history of the Dunmer, from the earliest accounts of the Morrowind era with the Chimer to the latest accounts from the 4th era. It took a very, very long time for me to figure out how to format this video properly. I spent weeks and now a couple months actually workshopping how to do this correctly, because there's so much information to unpack. So I really hope that you guys enjoy this video. And if you do enjoy this video, it'd be great if you could leave a like or comment or just subscribe, because it does tell me that you want to see more of this. And I do think the Dunmer are very, very interesting. So I would love to make more videos about them and their lore. So yeah, thank you so much for clicking on my video, and I really hope that you enjoy it. This is the history of the Dunmer. Just to clarify, when I look down, it's because my script notes are right there, so I'm not just like being weird. I'm looking down for reference. So before we begin, also I'd just like to clarify the overall history and kind of makeup of the Elder Scrolls universe. So the history of the world of Nirn and Tamriel is split into different eras, beginning with the Dawn era and then the Morrowind era. And these two are very much shrouded in mystery and legend. Somerset Isles were beginning to form distinct non-conformist groups. So the Aldmer of the Somerset Isles are the ancestor of all Mer on Tamriel, so the Bosmer, the Dunmer, the Dwemer, the Snow Elves. Those are all technically descendants of the Aldmer that dwelled in Somerset in the Dawn era and the Meretic era. And they worshipped the Aedra. So there were groups that were forming that did not partake in that specific kind of worship. The first of these groups was known as the Sijics, and if you want to know more about them, I do have a video on my channel about the Sijic order. These Sijics left the way of the Aldmer to pursue the Sijic endeavor. They view mortality as a test, and they aim to achieve immortality through following the rules of their endeavor. So this is a very clear contrast to the Aldmer, who kind of wallow in their loss of immortality, and they don't try to pursue it until they die, and they believe when they die they ascend to Aetherius, which is the realm of the gods, or the Aedra. But who we will be discussing is another group of non-conformists who began to gain influence, and they were called the Chimer, which translates to the changed ones. The Chimer were led by a man or a mer named Veloth, who would later become one of, if not the most important religious figure in Dunmer culture. While the Aldmer believed that Lorcan, in the creation of Mundus, had stolen their immortality, Veloth was taught by Boethia, Mephala, and Azura that the missing god was actually testing them, and that they were meant to become ambitious, to overcome the great obstacle of mortality through discipline and skill. Under the guidance of the three good Daedra, Azura, Mephala, and Boethia, Veloth's teachings became more widespread, and he imparted the three sisters' beliefs onto his followers. From Boethia, the Chimer learned strength, both physical and mental, and he tasked them with the responsibility to overcome their harsh circumstances and build something better, and he gifted them the will and ambition to do so. From Mephala, the Chimer learn cunning, and she imparts them with their penchant for assassination. The group, the Morag Tong, claims Mephala as their patron, and their presence in Morrowind and their secret murders are legally carried out. So assassination is viewed as a valid political tool in Morrowind thanks to Mephala. Mephala and Boethia are credited with establishing the Velothi clan system that would one day evolve into the great houses of Morrowind. And last but not least, from Azura, the Chimer learn wisdom and piety and the ability to distinguish themselves from other inferior Mer. Even according to other races, Azura is considered the most compassionate of the Daedric princes. But to scorn House of Troubles, or the Four Bad Daedra. These are Daedra who only wish ill on the Chimer, although the Four Bad Daedra also represent challenges that the Chimer must overcome. Each bad Daedra represents a different challenge. The first and most obvious challenge is set by the Daedric prince Molag Bal. He is the most transparent threat to the Chimer and the Dunmer. He directly attempts to interfere with the pure bloodlines of the Dunmer. He mixes up families and causes infighting. The second of the bad Daedra, Shealgarath, the Daedric Prince of Madness, tests the Chimer and the Dunmer for mental inferiority and entices them to insanity. Malakath is the third of the bad Daedra, and he is meant to test the physical and mental strength of the Chimer and later Dunmer. And lastly, Mehrunes Dagon is meant to represent the harsh landscape of Resdayn, later known as Morrowind. He forces the Chimer to consistently and constantly adapt and to remain resilient against all coming changes and challenges. Another distinguishing factor of the Chimer that set them apart from the other Aldmer is their practice of ancestor worship. Now, the old ways of Aldmiris, which the Sijic order follows, did practice ancestor worship, but as time passed, the Aldmer of Somerset began to only worship those who they considered to be the greatest of their ancestors, the Aedra. The Chimer and the Dunmer are known to pray to and worship their ancestors, even their most recent ones. This is seen as kind of strange by other races because the Dunmer summon their ancestors to the mortal plane and ask them for protection and guidance. This is a bit too close to necromancy for the Aldmer and later Altmer, so they view this as kind of heretical and blasphemous. The Chimer and Dunmer also view the three good Daedra as their ancestors. They just believe them to be the oldest and most powerful of all of them. The ancestor spirits are believed to gain power the older they become, but as they get older and more powerful, they tend to stay away from the mortal plane, I guess. Anyway, back to Veloth. So as Veloth began to gain more popularity and renown in Somerset, entire Aldmeri clans would abandon their ways to follow him. And when the Velothi people were threatened with banishment, Veloth decided it would be better to leave Somerset anyway, to find a new home where they could live openly and freely practice their ways. So Veloth led his people out of Somerset, across the vast sea, and northeast across the continent of Tamriel, to the ashen and fungal-infested land he named Resdayn, and he claimed it to be the Chimer's promised land. Compared to the meadows and fields of Somerset, Resdayn would seem like an impossible climate to any but the Chimer. A land that challenges them at every turn so that they can overcome it and reach their fullest potential, would sound absolutely perfect to this specific race. To understand the Dunmer, it is imperative that we understand the environment of fills the sky and landscape of Vardenfell and northern Morrowind with ash and dust, which makes it a harsh place to live, but that's kind of like the whole point. So, mainland Morrowind is bordered by the Sea of Ghosts to the north, the Patamaic Sea to the east, Argonia or Black Marsh to the south, Cyrodiil and the Imperials to the southwest, and Skyrim to the northwest west. The borders between Morrowind and Cyrodiil and Skyrim are made up by the Velothi mountain range, which is allegedly where the Prophet Veloth led his people through on their pilgrimage to Resdain. So it is his namesake. The northwestern mainland of Morrowind is almost entirely made up of this mountain range, except for a small coast on the eastern side, and the very northernmost region, which is controlled by House Redoran, which we will discuss later on. Of course, north of the Velothi Mountains is the island of Solstheim, which, depending on the era, belongs to Morrowind. But it's a significant geographical feature, so I thought I would mention it. The eastern foothills of the Velothi Mountains lead down to the fertile and ashy plains of Deshan. And just off the northeastern peninsula, which is called the Telvanni Peninsula, there are 3 islands which are very simply named the Northeastern Archipelago. They are said to have fertile soil and become a major trading spot for Else Telvanni. And as you descend further south toward Black Marsh, the land gets significantly more marshy. I thought that was clever. In the heart of Morrowind, there is the city of Mournhold, which plays a big part in Morrowind's political landscape throughout its history. But it's also of notable importance because it's directly in the heartland. Now, Vardenfell, which is the huge island that lays within the inner sea of Morrowind. Vardenfell is a Dwemeri word, and it means city of the strong shield. This huge island is mostly covered by the giant active volcano that determines its landscape, Red Mountain. This, of course, has never stopped the Dunmer from dwelling in the landscape most other races would consider inhospitable. The middle and northeastern regions, the middle and southeastern regions are mostly dry grasslands and volcanic wastelands, which are referred to as the Ashlands. Like much of Morrowind, the whole island is full of strange and unusual flora and fauna. There are deep ravines of lava that flow down from Red Mountain throughout the landscape and into the inner sea. And when the lava meets the water, it creates volcanic rock, or some kind of rock, cobblestone. And the island slowly exceptionally damaging to the island. Even when the landscape is burned, life returns to Vardenfell. This kind of symbolizes a cycle of life, death, and rebirth that is a common theme in Dunmer and Dwemer culture. The nomadic Ashlanders have always been known to live on Vardenfell, but none of the great houses have really established themselves there, mostly keeping to the mainland while having small settlements and some large cities on Vardenfell. So that is the landscape and general environment of Morrowind. Back to the history. The Dwemer arrived in Resdain from the southwest through the Velothi Mountains. The first city to be founded in Resdain was named Narcissus, where all fervently praise the prophet Veloth. Over time, it has simply been shortened to Narcissus. Many other settlements were created and built by the Velothi at this time, with Boethia being ascribed with helping the Dwemer build appropriate architecture. Appropriate architecture. 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 I think that's so tingly. And indeed, the Dwemer and later Dunmer have some of the most recognizable architecture in all of Tamriel. The Dwemer begin to thrive in their promised land, and they build massive temples to their Daedric princes. They excel culturally, academically, and religiously at this time, leading to a period in Dwemer history known as the Age of High Velothi Culture, or simply the Velothi Golden Age. Although the Dwemer quickly took to Resdain, they were not the only race who dwelt there. The Dwemer, with their advanced technology and mechanical cities, dwelled in northern Vardenfell and deep underground beneath the Dwemer. There were also Nedic tribes to the southwest who sought land in Resdain, perhaps a safer place to live away from the oppression of their Aelid overlords. The Dwemer had a brief war with the Needs in the southern region of Stone Falls, but very little is known of the reason behind this conflict. It is only known that two Dwemer brothers, Zadal and Balreth, were magically enhanced to defeat the hordes of Needs. But although they were victorious, their rage nor their power declined, and they became a danger to all, and they were given the name the Brothers of Strife. They were only stopped when they were both imprisoned. Balreth was chained to Ash Mountain, and Zadal bound to the tormented spire. This is a very kind of legendary conflict between these two races, and as far as we know, there were no further conflicts between the Dwemer and the Needs. Where the Dwemer really took issue and spent much time in contact with were the Dwemer. The Dwemer and the Dwemer are like two sides of the same coin. The Dwemer are staunchly religious and believe that they can achieve better things by overcoming the challenges set out before them by following the path of the good Daedra. The Dwemer are unfaltering in their anti-religion, and they openly disavow the gods, both Aedra and Daedra, believing they could achieve immortality through These were specialized warriors in the ancient Skyrim world who used the Thuum, or the shouts, to overcome other races. And although the Chimer and the Dwemer were adept in both physical combat and magic, the overwhelming power of the Nords was unstoppable. And in First Era 240, all Chimer were under the subjugation of the Nords, and the Dwemer had been forced to retreat into their hidden cities. And for almost 2 centuries, the Nords were relentless in their oppression, and after years of struggle, the Chimer and the Dwemer were forced to pardon each other's differences and work together to form the First Council, which would eventually become the ruling governmental system in Resdayn. This council consisted of great houses Indoril, Redorin, Lalu, Tilvani, Dress, Dagoth, and Dwemer. House Dwemer was more so a symbol that just represented the Dwemer that lived in Resdayn at that time. The Dwemer's representative was Dumog, Dwarf King, and the Chimer's representative was a Chimer named Indoril Nerovar. Now, with the combined forces of the Chimer's superior warriors and mages, and the Dwemer's mechanical military, they were able to force the Nords out, back across the Velothi Mountains into the west to Skyrim. With this newfound alliance between 2 historic foes, Resdayn saw a long period of peace under the governance of the First Council. But of course this could not last. Exactly how the war of the First Council came about is heavily disputed by scholars in-game, and therefore we are a bit unsure why the conflict ensued. Quite frankly, this conflict and war could use its own video because there is a lot of conflicting accounts on it. So I just realized I've been breathing directly into the mic, and I'm sorry about that. Sorry. I'll try to not do that now. With this newfound alliance between 2 historic foes, Resdayn saw a long period of peace under the governance of the First Council. But of course this could not last. Some sources claim that the war began in First Era 668, which was the first recorded account of the eruption of Red Mountain. Its ash blocked out the sun, and the year is referred to as the sun's death. I'm now going to read a probably biased and skewed to some extent account of the War of the First Council. This is a book from in-game, which is titled The War of the First Council by Agrippa Fundilius The secular forces were outmaneuvered and defeated with the help of Ashlander scouts, and the survivors forced to take refuge in the Dwemer stronghold at Red Mountain. After a brief siege, treason permitted Nerevar and his troops to enter the stronghold, where the secular leaders were slain and Nerevar mortally wounded. General slaughter followed, and houses Dwemer and Dagoth were exterminated. Nerevar died shortly thereafter of his wounds. 3 of Nerevar's associates among the Orthodox houses, Vivek, Almalexia, and Sothasil, succeeded to control of the recreated First Council, renamed the Grand Council of Morrowind, and went on to become the God Kings and immortal rulers of Morrowind, known as the Tribunal, or Almsevi. There are, of course, other accounts of the Battle of Red Mountain and what exactly happened. Vivek himself gives an account of the War of the First Council and its conclusion at Red Mountain, as well as the Curse of Azura and the Tribunal's ascension to godhood, but I think that would be best saved for a video specifically about the war or about Vivek. The Ashlanders, of course, have their own version, allegedly shared with them by Alondro Sul, one of Indoril Nerevar's companions. The Ashlander version tells of the Nerevarine, the reincarnation of Indoril Nerevar, and how he will one day return to kind of right the wrong that Almalexia, Sothasil, and Vivek did by using the power they swore not to use. Now, regardless of the events of the war as a whole, it all culminated in the Battle of Red Mountain, which took place in First Era 700. What is agreed upon, regardless of the exact details, is the aftermath, which made 2 things clear. All Dwemer that had existed on Nirn had disappeared by some magic of the Heart of Lorkhan. The Heart of Lorkhan lays under the Red Mountain and is most likely House Indoril and Redorin become known for their piety and loyalty to the Tribunal Temple. House Dress and Lalu have friendly relations, but nothing significant. And of course, House Telvanni doesn't really have any interest in that. So, yeah, House Telvanni very much remains independent and in their own kind of world, even though they are part of the Greater Morrowind. House Indoril itself gains the most power and influence through its connection to the Tribunal, particularly Almalexia. Most of the priesthood of the Tribunal consists of Dunmer from House Indoril. After the rise of the Tribunal, the Ashlander tribes claim them to be false gods, and they carry on the Velothi traditions of Daedra worship and ancestor worship. The other Dunmer also continue ancestor worship. Should clarify that. The ancestor worship never stops. This results in the Ashlanders being forced out. The Ashlanders are not included in any politics. They're not included in any autonomy. They are rarely consulted when the Grand Council does anything of significance. So they are very much forced out to the kind of fringes of society for the next couple millennia. The rest of the First Era passes mostly peacefully for the Dunmer of Morrowind. But in Second Era, 2703, the Tribunal and Riemann Cyrodiil of the Second Cyrodiilic Empire form an alliance against the oncoming threat of the First Akaviri invasion, and they successfully repel it together. The Akaviri invasion, the first one, they were coming kind of through Morrowind to get to Cyrodiil, so that's why they teamed up to push them back. Eventually, the alliance between Morrowind and Riemann Cyrodiil is broken when Riemann the First is assassinated by the Morag Tong, possibly under Vivek's orders. It is unknown exactly why, but that's the point of assassination. The results of this assassination is the Fourscore War, a war that begins in First Era 2840 and lasts 80 years between the Second Empire and the Dunmer of Morrowind. So Riemann II, who is the son of Riemann I, is successful in conquering all of Tamriel, with the famous exception of Morrowind. Even when Riemann II was killed either in battle or by the Morag Tong, his son, Riemann III, continues the fight with Morrowind. And after, of course, years of bloodshed and mass loss of life on both sides, in the last year of the First Era, 2920, the two nations finally enter peace negotiations. But before these negotiations could be decided, Riemann III and all of his heirs were assassinated by the Morag Tong. And this is when the potentates kind of take over the Second Empire. So Potentate Versaduce is the one who signs a truce with the Grand Council and officially ends the Fourscore War. The Dunmer are victorious enough, but of course this does not make them immune to other disasters. And in the last year of the First Era, the city of Mournhold, which is the capital of Morrowind for most of Morrowind's history until the Fourth Era. So Mournhold is
was destroyed and sacked by Mehrunes Dagon in First Era 2920. Allegedly, this is because the Duke of Mournhold had scorned his favorite mistress after learning she was pregnant, and in retaliation of his actions, she used sorcery to open a gate to oblivion in Mournhold, and of course from it emerged Mehrunes Dagon and his Daedric armies, which then sacked and destroyed the entire city of Mournhold. And when this happened, Vivek was supposedly busy with the Riemann Empire, so Almalexia and Sothasil were left to face the Daedric Prince of Change alone. And they managed, after a very long struggle, to force him back into oblivion and close the portal. Mournhold was destroyed, but Almalexia set out to restore it to its former glory, and after that it was renamed Almalexia in her honor. This marks the end of the First Era, and the Dunmer of Morrowind enter the Second Era, still under the rule of the Tribunal, but now that they have proved their undying fealty to the Dunmer, they become more influential than ever in Morrowind. As we enter the Second Era, the first few centuries of which are relatively peaceful in Morrowind, especially compared to the 80-year-long war they just had. But in Second Era 324, the Moragtong strike once again and assassinate Potentate Versaduce. Supposedly this is when the Moragtong gets a little bit arrogant and writes the words Moragtong on the wall of Potentate Versaduce's bedchambers in his own blood, and the blatant admittance of this assassination leads to the banishment of the Moragtong throughout all of Tamriel except in Morrowind. And this is allegedly when a group of the Moragtong breaks off to form the Dark Brotherhood, but that is all kind of conjecture. The Moragtong also kills any remaining heirs of Potentate Versaduce, or any potentates, by Second Era 430, officially ending the Second Empire. And there would not be another power in Cyrodiil until the rise of Tiber Septim 1 year after the fall of the Second Empire in Second Era 431. The Kingdom of Skyrim splits into East and West kingdoms. This will become important for Morrowind's history later on. It is of significant note that the use of slaves was considerably widespread in Morrowind at this point in history, since around the early First Era, particularly in House Dress and Telvanni lands, although the other houses were not openly opposed to it. The house that most benefited from this trade was House Dress, as their territory was closest to Blackmarsh, and most of those who were sold into slavery were Argonians. House Dress soldiers would consistently raid Argonian villages and settlements all throughout northern Blackmarsh, and return with their cargo to the slaver capital of Stormhold. When the Second Empire held dominion over Blackmarsh, it was much harder for the slavers of House Dress and Telvanni to openly kidnap Argonians. But with the fall of the Second Empire, Blackmarsh was nowhere near as protected as it once was, and it is said that House Dress and Telvanni took this opportunity and sprinted with it, launching their trade through the roof and highest trees to manufacture this disease, but the actual origin is unknown. House Redorin sent a military expedition into Black Marsh to the alleged origin of the flu, the Zot tribe in the Shadowfen region of Black Marsh, with the intention of wiping them out and hopefully therefore wiping out any further infections, but it is unknown if they were successful. Now, the Connaughton flu devastated Morrowind and all of Tamriel for the next 4 decades, until about Second Era 603. The Kothringi tribe of men native to Argonia are believed to have been wiped out by this disease. And when it did subside, slavers did not want to risk anything worse, so many refused to travel into Black Marsh, except the slavers of House Duress, whose society ran on slave labor, so they actually could not function without it. Therefore, they continued the historic raids of the northern regions of the Argonians' homeland. The plague destroyed entire cultures and effectively disabled many governments across Tamriel, as the most they could do was wait it out. When the disease did subside, it was relatively quiet in Morrowind for another 169 years, until Second Era 572 and the Second Akaviri invasion. The Akaviri commander Adasum Dir Kamal cut his way through eastern Skyrim, destroying wind was formed between the Dunmer, excluding House Delphani. They didn't want anything to do with it. So between the Dunmer, the Nords of Eastern Skyrim, and the Argonian tribes of Shadowfen and Thornmarsh. In recognition of their crucial aid, the Dunmer freed all Argonian slaves. Although House Dres and Delphani were still known to practice slavery, just very subtly, if you can say that. And because House Delphani was not part of the Ebony Pact, they still continued to take Argonian slaves. Slavery was still permitted in Delphani territory, and House Dres kept up their practice of enslavement, just non-Argonians. Stormhold became the center of the Ebony Pact, and all slavers that still attempted to continue their malicious trade were severely punished. The Ebony Pact lasts for a time, but there is of course remaining tension between these races, especially between the Dunmer and the Argonians, particularly in Stormhold, with the Daggerfall Covenant to the west and the Aldmeri Dominion to the southwest, and the heart of Tamriel, Cyrodiil, unprotected by an empire. It is no wonder that these three ended up at war, fighting over the historical seat of power on the continent. When the first Aldmeri Dominion is formed, last of the three alliances in Second Era 580, the Dominion continually tries to sow deceit among the Dunmer and the Argonians of Stormhold by assassinating Dunmer and making it look like it was an Argonian act of revenge. But the Dominion was discovered, and the Three Banners War breaks out in the same year of Second Era 580. Each alliance had a different goal in this war. The Dominion wished to reestablish ultimate power all over Tamriel. The Covenant wanted to restore the old Riemann Empire in the name of stability, and the Pact seeked to preserve their independence altogether, as they were against both the Empire and the Dominion. Each alliance invaded Cyrodiil and fought over the White Gold Tower in Second Era 580, which we believe resulted in a bloody massacre, and yet the final outcome of the war remains unknown, although obviously the Empire was not restored and the Dominion did not rise to power at this time. Each alliance was disbanded by the last century of the Second Era, and I think, just based on what we know from the rest of the history, Argonian slavery was kind of just made legal again, but it became much less prevalent in territories outside of Dres and Delphani lands. So like House Redoran, it's very uncommon to find an Argonian slave in House Redoran territory or Indoril territory or like Lalu territory. It's just uncommon, but it was still happening with Dres and Delphani because they have societies that run on slavery. Morrowind remained under the governance of the Tribunal Temple and the Grand Council of Great Houses until the very end of the Second Era. Tiber Septim, also known as Talos, was born in Second Era 828. Now things remain mostly peaceful in Morrowind until Second Era 882, when Red Mountain erupts again. And this is because Dagoth who has been basically sleeping under Red Mountain since the Battle of Red Mountain, he awakens under the mountain, and him and his minions bind themselves to the heart of Lorkhan. And the heart of Lorkhan is the source of the Tribunal's divinity and power. So if that gets damaged or hurt or taken away from them in any way, it is assumed lose their power. So, Dagoth-ur also ambushes the Tribunal when they attempt their annual ritual of bathing in the power of the heart, and they force them out of the chamber, and the Tribunal is locked out of the chamber and locked away from their source of power. The Tribunal do everything in their power to get back into the chamber, for fear that they may lose their power and be unable to protect their nation and people from the scourge of Dagoth-ur. Due to this event, Sothasil began constructing the mechanical heart, which would be a recreation of the heart of Lorkhan, in case they could not secure the real one. While the Tribunal is caught up in trying to solve the Dagoth-ur problem, Tiber Septim is conquering all of Tamriel, and he's doing it fast. So the great houses are split on how to deal with this. House Redorin, Indoril, and Dress are all against an empire that removes their autonomy, and they swear to defend Morrowind and Dunmer culture to their deaths. House Lalu, basically, they are all for the empire, so long as they continue making money. That's kind of their thing. And the Telvanni, as always, have very little interest in helping defend and very little interest in being ruled, but ultimately they were quite indifferent in the conflict. So when the unstoppable force of General Talos' armies arrive in Morrowind, there is a bloody struggle with House Redorin forces. Their borders are on the west, so they would be the first target. And Vivek appears and begins negotiations between the Tribunal and Tiber Septim. If the Tribunal was not already busy with Dagoth-ur, it's possible they would have fought more. But regardless, they come to a peaceful solution by signing what is called the Armistice. So, the terms of the Armistice are as follows. The Dunmer agreed to the Armistice as long as they were allowed to define and preserve their own laws and customs. So, slavery was still legal, local house guards and great house law were still in place. House wars were allowed, and the Morakdong, of course, was still allowed, but only in Morrowind. Dunmeri religious practices were recognized as a faith by the Empire. So the Empire worshipped the 8 divines until Tiber Septim died and ascended to godhood. So usually this would be persecuted because the Dunmer are not Daedra worshippers at this time, but they don't worship the Aedra, which is often seen as blasphemous. Ardenfell was kept as a temple preserve because Dagoth-ur was there, and the Tribunal was trying to kind of cover that up so as to not worry any Dunmer. And there was like a general policy of not interfering with the Tribunal temple at that time. So Morrowind remained mostly autonomous of their own laws and like religious practices and stuff. In response to that, the Empire said that Morrowind would have to be ruled by a king that was selected by the Emperor of Cyrodiil, so that there was always someone who was representing the Empire in Morrowind. The Numidium was given to Tiber Septim. The Numidium was this huge automaton that Tiber Septim used to conquer the Somerset Isles. It was allegedly built by Kagranak, who originally discovered the heart of Lorkhan before the War of the First Council. And the Empire also was allowed to have a constant military presence in Morrowind, so this really pushed back House Redorin. House Redorin is the Dunmer military, and most of their power was taken away by the Empire because of this. With the exception of like Great House Law, Morrowind was almost entirely under the governance of the Empire. House Indoril falls out of power at this time after millennia of power, and House jumps in and fills that void that House Indoril leaves behind, because they're kind of suck-ups. Many Dunmer, especially those in House Indoril, saw the signing of the armistice as an act of betrayal of traditional values from the Tribunal. Many House Indoril nobles took their own lives rather than be subject to the Empire's rule. House Redoran only fell in line due to their duty and piety to the Tribunal, who commanded that they fall in line. House Dress only agreed to the armistice when their right to enslavement was protected. House Delphani only agreed when House Redoran and Lalu did, and House Lalu was the faction most keen on the Empire, and because of this they cozied right up to them and ended up becoming a political powerhouse in this province, while the Third Empire had Morrowind under its control. So after centuries, after millennia of House Indoril dominating the Grand Council, they began to decline and only really stayed prominent under the Tribunal's service in Mournhold specifically. By Second Era 896, Tiber Septim had managed to conquer all of Tamriel, something that had never been done before and likely will not be done again, and he declares the beginning of a new era at the end of the year. The Third Era in Morrowind is definitively characterized by the rise of Dagoth-Ur and the blight he curses upon the land, and the fall of the Tribunal, so sad, also known as the events of the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind. So during the Third Era, House Lalu establishes very good relations with the Empire, and their political power and influence soars. They use this jump in influence to claim land and settle old grudges between mostly House Redoran and Indoril, their historical rivals. At this time, a Dunmer woman, Baranzaya, was made queen by Tiber Septim once she came of age. She eventually married a Dunmer man who was loyal to the Septims, and his name was Symmachus. They had 2 children, a son, Helseth, and a daughter, Morgaya. This will be important later. House Indoril, the traditionally dominating house in Morrowind, is reduced to only holding power in Mournhold, their capital, and House Redoran loses all their power when the military is forcibly reduced. And House Dress and Delphani still have very little care for the rest of the nation so long as they can continue undisturbed. The defining event of the Third Era is the awakening of Dagoth-Ur. So with Dagoth-Ur awakening in Second Era 882, the Tribunal had to find a way to protect their people. So they erected what is called the Ghost Fence. The Ghost Fence was a huge magical barrier that surrounded most of the area around Red Mountain, and it held back Dagoth's blight and the cursed creatures that it would produce. To power the Ghost Fence, the Tribunal was required to dedicate a portion of their power at all times to keeping it up, which over time began to strain them, especially because it seemed as if this curse was impossible to defeat. because they were trying to cover up Dagoth-Ur's presence. The Blight ended up being the reason behind closures of Ebony and Malachite mines, which would directly affect Morrowind's economy. The East Empire Company and House Delvani, Lalu, and Redorin had established several settlements on the island, but as time went on, it became apparent that living and trading on Vardenfell would only become harder and harder if the Blight and its origins were not addressed. Things take a turn for the worse for the Tribunal in Third Era 417. In an attempt to retake Red Mountain and the heart of Lorkhan from Dagoth-Ur, Almalexia and Sothasil lose two of Kagranak's tools, Keening and Asunder. These tools were used by the Tribunal to harness the power of the heart of Lorkhan, so they were integral to securing their divinity, and their loss was really, really bad. Almalexia and Sothasil only survive because Vivek appeared to save them. And as time goes on, the Tribunal becomes weaker and weaker, with no access to the heart and with a portion of their power consistently dedicated to the Ghost Defense. Where the Tribunal used to be very outwardly focused and public for all to see, that's what makes living gods so enticing. They now begin to isolate themselves, and eventually they all stop appearing in public, for fear that they'll let on how much power they have lost. They do not want to appear weak in front of their people. This is when the dissident priests become a threat to the Tribunal. The dissident priests are a cult-like faction within the Tribunal priesthood that doubts them. They believe in the Nerevarine prophecies of the Ashlanders, much of which dispute the dogmatic beliefs of the Tribunal and the Temple. So many of these priests were shunned and forced into hiding, but they continued to study and produce works that would be contradictory to Temple teachings, helping to spread the truth about the Nerevarine, but also growing doubt among Dunmer of the Tribunal's power and rightful influence. The dissident priests were not hostile to Dunmer or really to the Tribunal. They only wanted to prove that there was more to be said, and that the people of Vardenfell needed something to hold on to in this time of fear and strife. They gave them a religious prophecy, and it worked. Eventually, the dissident priests become the major religious organization after the fall of the Tribunal. Civil unrest also picks up in Morrowind at this time. There are tax revolts in the Redorin-controlled city of Belmora on Vardenfell. Organized crime becomes much more common, and the Sixth House begins carrying out assassinations on Imperials and Lalu supporters, as well as more random attacks that take place as the cult grows in numbers. The Dunmer begin to start questioning their authority figures, and the governing body is severely weakened. But then, on the 16th day of Last Seed, Third Era 427, an Outlander arrives in Vardenfell. It is unknown at this time, but this Outlander was the prophesized Nerevarine, Azura's promised champion, and reincarnation of Indoral Nerevar, here to defeat Dagoth-Ur and restore Morrowind to peace. By the time of the arrival of the Nerevarine, the Tribunal was split. Almalexia almost never left her palace in Mournhold. Sothasil secluded himself to his clockwork tower, constantly working on the second heart, and this left Vivek alone on Vardenfell to defend against Dagoth-Ur. 6th house. Considering they had proved themselves to all the Dunmer, and the Tribunal was exceedingly desperate at this point. So the Nerevarine meets with the living god Vivek, and he entrusts the hero with the last tool of Kagranak, Wraithguard. Vivek instructs the Nerevarine on how to sever the connection between the 6th house and the heart of Lorkhan. Vivek then publicly announces that this outlander is the prophesied Nerevarine, and that the hope of Vardenfell is in their hands. In turn, the Nerevarine swears an oath to defeat Dagoth-Ur to the best of their abilities. The Nerevarine is successful in their mission, severing the heart's connection, defeating Dagoth-Ur in personal combat, and destroying his automaton that he planned to use to take over Tamriel. Without the power of the heart, Dagoth-Ur's power ceased to be, and he finally died. But when the Nerevarine severed the connection between Dagoth-Ur and the heart, the connection to the Tribunal was also cut, and Vivek foretold to the hero that the Tribunal's days were numbered, as their power would only wane from now on. But Vivek seemed to accept that the Dunmer would eventually return to the old ways of Daedra worship, and he officially handed over the responsibility of keeping Morrowind safe to the Nerevarine. Vivek then said that he would use what remained of his power to perform humble deeds of goodness for his people, whom he always loved. The other two tribunes did not accept their fate with such grace. Almalexia was driven mad by her loss of power, isolated in her palace. When the Nerevarine visits her, she commands them to murder Sothasil, claiming that he was the one who had gone mad. When the Nerevarine refuses, Almalexia goes to the Clockwork City and kills the last member of House Sotha herself. Her plan was to kill Vivek and then gain all the power from the worshipping Dunmer to herself, but the Nerevarine must fulfill their prophecy, and Almalexia falls at their hands. When the Nerevarine informs Vivek of these events, he is mournful at the loss of his old friends. But he knew that this would come. Vivek is said to have gathered the bodies of his lost friends and interred them in the traditional Velothi fashion from the days of their youth. Although it is unknown exactly what happened to Vivek after this, it is assumed that he quietly left and lived out the remainder of his days in some kind of peace before eventually succumbing to his mortality. Thus ends the millennia-long rule of the three living gods. Their influence over Morrowind and their love for its people would never be forgotten in the Dunmer memory, and their actions were honored by the canonization of becoming saints in the New Temple's traditions. And last of what was heard of the Nerevarine was that they were sailing east out of Morrowind to the continent of Akavir. For what reason remains unknown. With the loss of the Tribunal, Morrowind becomes an even more confusing place to live, with everyone once again vying for the status and power that the Tribunal left behind. When the Tribunal falls, the Third Empire still holds power over the province of Morrowind, although it is waning, and King Helseth, son of Queen Baranziah, becomes reigning monarch. While he reigns, he outlaws the Dunmer tradition of slavery in the Third Era 430, and bloody revolution takes place. Regardless of our human biases, many Dunmer saw this as a betrayal, especially since this practice was protected by the armistice. It is said that King Helseth also re-established the Grand Council, so his intentions and his alliances are slightly baffling. 3 years after this, the Oblivion Crisis begins on the 27th of last Last Seed, 3rd Era, 433. And Oblivion Gates open all over Tamriel, including Morrowind. The Empire removes its troops from Morrowind to protect their homeland. This once again gives House Redoran the freedom to raise a Dunmer military for the first time since before the armistice. Aldrune, a major city in Redoran land on Vardenfell, is sacked by Daedra, but altogether House Redoran keeps a lot of Morrowind from destruction. If they did not defend, the damage would have been much, much worse. Since the Empire pulled out of Morrowind and had to recover after the Oblivion Crisis and the re-establishment of House Redoran as the military might of Morrowind, this is most likely when Morrowind ceased to be a province of the Third Empire, and all power of governance was returned to the Grand Council. Third Era 433 is the last year of the Third Era, and once Mehrunes Dagon is banished by the hero of Kvatch, the Septim bloodline is ended and the Amulet of Kings no more. A new era is declared. The Fourth Era begins disastrously for the Dunmer. In the 5th year of the Fourth Era, the asteroid known as Bor Dao, that floats above Vivek City on the southern shores of Vardenfell, falls to the ground, and its impact causes Red Mountain to erupt once again to the most devastating degree. Bor Dao is a large asteroid, sometimes called a moon, that came hurtling toward Morrowind during the early days of the Tribunal's rule. Some accounts claim that it was thrown by the Mad Prince Sheogorath, but Bor Dao did not reach land because of Vivek, with his newly acquired divine power, halted the asteroid in its descent and held it above his city for the next several millennia. He is quoted with saying, "I shall keep it there with its last intention intact, so that if the love of the people of this city for me ever disappear, so shall the power that holds back their destruction." A little bit tyrannical there, but that's what he said. Bor Dao was made hollow and became the Tribunal Temple's Ministry of Truth. This is where they would imprison dissident priests, who would be held until the fall of the Tribunal. Sometime after Vivek's disappearance, two Dunmer men called Vuan and Sul constructed a soul-powered device called the Ingenium, which would hold up Bor Dao in place of Vivek's power. But the Ingenium required a ridiculous amount of souls to continue operating, and many were sacrificed to keep it working, including Sul's lover. And in his attempt to rescue her soul, Sul damaged the Ingenium, and Bor Dao plummeted toward Vivek City with all the momentum it had when Vivek paused its descent thousands of years before. The impact was so intense it caused tsunamis throughout the inner sea, having disastrous consequences throughout mainland Morrowind, like earthquakes and flooding, even as far as Tyr and further south into Blackmarsh. Vivek City itself was utterly wiped off the face of Tamriel, and the crater left would become known as the Scathing Bay thereafter. All the major cities and settlements on Vardenfell were devastated, especially by the eruption of Red Mountain, which was triggered by the impact of Bor Dao. Even as far north as southern Solstheim was turned to an ash-barren wasteland, the air of Morrowind filled with smoke and ash, and all who breathed it choked. The landscape of Vardenfell was scorched, the worst it had ever been, and Dunmer refugees poured out of their homeland as they were forced to flee. House Redorin steps in and blocks them from marching further northwest. But the Argonian forces sack and destroy the city of Mournhold, and the capital is officially moved to the Redorin capital in the very northwest, called Black Light. House Redorin is really the chief reason behind Morrowind continuing to hold its own after the fall of the Tribunal, the Oblivion Crisis, and the Red Year, which is why they become the most influential house on the Grand Council in the Fourth Era. With the Empire gone, House Lalu has nothing to cling to anymore, and the Dunmer are looking for someone to lead them after the Tribunal's disappearance, and House Indoril no longer has the power to do so, and House Dresden Delvani never would step up. So finally, House Redorin gets their moment. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm kind of obsessed with them for some reason. Outside of Morrowind, the Third Empire begins to lose its influence over Tamriel, causing Black Marsh to officially secede and provinces to the south to leave as well. Due to the devastation caused by the Red Year, Dunmer are fleeing their homeland in droves, and the High King of Skyrim bequests the island of Solstheim to Morrowind in 4th Era 16, so they can have somewhere to live closer than farther from home. Skyrim became the main province that the Dunmer fled to after this disaster. In 4th Era 20, a monument named Refugees' Rest was built on the northeastern borders of Skyrim as a place of rest for Dunmer who were fleeing to the west. In the early 4th Era, House Lalu was voted, or more likely forced, out of the Grand Council of Great Houses and was replaced by House Sadras. Most likely, this is because of the fact that House Lalu became so cozy with the Empire. But it could also be that House Redorin bore a grudge towards House Lalu, and they kind of just wanted them out. House Redorin became the most prominent house on the Grand Council, and Lalu bore a grudge toward them, blaming their loss of title and power on the militant house. House Lalu attempts to seize control of the island of Solstheim over House Redorin twice, once in 4th Era 95, and once in 4th Era 201, the latter of which was thwarted by the last Dragonborn. The Dunmer of Morrowind are not involved in the Great War between the Third Aldmeri Dominion and the Third Empire, and they remain largely unscathed from that. The loss of the Tribunes and the ruin of their homeland from the Red Year leaves the Dunmer looking for hope and faith in the vacuum of power in religion. Some continue to worship the Tribunal, but most Dunmer return to worshipping the Three Good Daedra, now called the Reclamations. The Tribunal were still prominent in collective memory, and so they were not dismissed from the temple, but their roles were reduced to sacred heroes and saints. This reintroduction of Daedra worship vindicated the Ashlanders who were scorned for millennia because they refused to worship the Tribunal over the Three Sisters. Many Dunmer begin to view the Ashlanders as keepers of the old ways, and some even make the harsh journey into the Ashlands to speak with them, particularly the Ashlander wise women, who are said to open Dunmer's eyes to the lies of the Tribunal and the truth of Azura, Mephala, and Boethia. The new temple easily takes root in Dunmer society and culture by the 1st century of the 4th
tracing all the way back to their Velothi ancestors, the Dunmer have built their society and culture on overcoming unfathomable odds and succeeding. The Dunmer's irrepressible need to prove themselves will aid them in remaining as a major contender on Tamriel far into the future of the realm. I want to thank you all so much for